John Batchelor. Malcom Hoenlein, Conference of President, is here. Malcom, what is the purpose of a phylactery? It's in the Hebrew. I read that it's the name is tefillin.
Tefillin. Tefillin are two cases, pairs of leather cases, one that is attached to the arm during prayer, the morning prayer, and one that is put on the head, and it is based upon biblical passages from the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy, where it says that it should be a sign on your hand, and totafos beininecha, and remembrance between your eyes, that the senses, one near your heart, one near your brain, and that these, and they're attached to leather thongs. So people who have been on airplanes and seen people praying, Jews praying, will have noticed these. And the amazing thing now that we find that we're going to discuss shows these tefillin that date back to more than 2,000 years ago, which shows the continuity, and I think our guest will be able to highlight for us whether, in fact, are they the same, and what does it mean that this amazing discovery that had laid hidden for all of this time, these 9 tiny scrolls.
We welcome Lawrence A. Schiffman, Larry Schiffman, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Yeshiva University, formerly the Chair of New York University's Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. Professor, a very good evening to you. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Malcom was kind enough to send me there several times, sitting in 44 degrees centigrade heat, to learn about the magical discovery of these scrolls left in potteries, very carefully kept when the Romans were sweeping through in their raids during the Jewish revolt. In there as well was the phylacteries, but they were overlooked until recently. What is the significance of this discovery? Why such excitement? Good evening to you, Larry.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. I think one of the things that's really astounding about the Dead Sea Scrolls in general is that they have a kind of magical interest for people, because you literally, when you see them, you're jumping across 2 millennia and a little bit more to a period that's so important for the history of our Western religious tradition. It's the period when Judaism is moving from its biblical form to its Talmudic form, and when Christianity is coming into being a little bit later. And so it's great to get any new knowledge from this corpus. Now, what happened here was there are published phylacteries, that is tefillin, which have been known in the field for some time. There are a few more than 20. Most of them were very broken, both the scrolls inside with the biblical passages, as well as the capsules, as we call them in English, that are the actual containers, which are strapped on, as Malcom was describing. Now, however, there was one complete phylactery that was published by the great Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, and beyond that, most of the material was broken. Now, what happened here is that an Israeli scholar, Yonatan Adler, who actually is originally an American who moved to Israel, was able to realize that some of what were thought to be crushed containers had actual small, minuscule scrolls in them. Now, this was done with an MRI machine at Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, and having determined that, we're now awaiting the technical expertise that will tell us how these can be opened so that the actual passages that are inside can be examined. And I just heard from Yonatan Adler just recently that they're just beginning to work through that question of how to actually open them.
Do you think the texts will be the same?
We have to realize about the texts being the same. These are, there are 2 possible ways of discussing that. Now, the first thing is that we have the question of exactly which biblical verses are contained. Because the way the rabbis understood this, and apparently this is what was done by everybody in ancient Jewish circles, is that there are certain passages that mention the putting on of the words of God onto the hand and the heart. And these passages are always in the tefillin. What happens at the Dead Sea Scrolls versions is there are 2 kinds. There's one that we call Pharisaic tefillin for that main Jewish sect that is the forerunners of the rabbis of the Talmud. And that type of tefillin has exactly the same contents, the 4 passages that are in the Talmudic tefillin and in the ones used until today. But there are some Qumran tefillin that will start above or below in the passage. And that results in some very important additions. For example, right before Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, which mentions the frontlets between your eyes, and therefore is in the tefillin. Right above it in Deuteronomy is the Ten Commandments, as a result of which the Ten Commandments gets into some Qumran tefillin. And this is what we mean when we speak about not having the same text. There's another
the core
issue.
text remains the same. It's the additions that you're talking about.
That's right. There's another small issue that people really don't understand, which is that many Dead Sea Scrolls biblical texts have some small variations of no great meaning with ours. And that will be found in the Qumran tefillin, as has been the situation with the past Qumran tefillin that were excavated and were published.
And John, you know, we should point out that Qumran is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there were about 10,000. So these were really, of the fragments and everything found, these were put aside.
I think it was Kincaid number 4. They didn't know what they were.
These were really put aside. What happened was that they didn't know there was anything inside them. They thought that they were crushed cases, and they published pictures of the crushed cases and then just put them aside then after they were known.
My understanding of what happened, Malcolm, is that the Romans were sweeping down the Dead Sea Valley. They were headed for Masada. Eventually, that was the standoff that led to the Masada episode. And this is at the end of the Jewish revolt. And the people who were at Qumran were going to be murdered if they didn't flee. And so they hid someone hid what they could in pottery that were in caves underneath. And no one noticed it until, I think the story is right after the Second War. Somebody threw a stone.
Yeah, that was the famous Bedouin boy. But the only thing that should be added, though, to what you're saying is that actually we now know that there are two types of caves in Qumran. And one of them is what you described, which I would say is like a refuge cave where you throw stuff when you're ready to run away. And we know that Qumran was probably destroyed in 68 CE. The temple destroyed in 70 and Masada in 73. But then we also have other caves that were basically library caves. And that's the case with the famous Cave 4. Now there were no jars. There apparently in antiquity were shelves that collapsed. And so the phylacteries found there, it's not exactly clear whether they were put there earlier or when they were running away. Of course, traditionally we know that Jews brought their phylacteries with them no matter where they went, and this was the case during the Holocaust. Many people succeeded somehow, miraculously, in having phylacteries at least for some part of their terrible ordeal.
But this does have political ramifications at a time when people are denying the presence of Jews, the existence of Jewish states dating back even hundreds of years, let alone 2,000 years ago. And you see
not only with the Dead Sea Scrolls,
continuity.
It's also been the case with Masada and the Bar Kokhba documents. But the interesting thing about this is there is actually a political ramification to this whole thing, which was that in the aftermath of Oslo, the Palestinians were demanding the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think it's pretty hard to believe that Israelis were going to give them to them, but we should remember that many of the collections, much of the Qumran material was purchased while Qumran was in Jordan and placed under the care of the Jordanian Antiquities Authority. So there might have been some money changing hands over the scrolls had there actually been a successful peace process. But I guess that's a subject which we're now, how many years later, still talking about.
There is an exhibit where you can view some of the Dead Sea Scrolls is at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it's a marvel when you get into it. It's very controlled conditions. I want to go back to Qumran, Professor, because we went so fast to get excited teaching John what a phylactery is. I did not ask the obvious question. Qumran, how did it serve? What was the nature of that community with the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, what we seem to know from the excavation of the site and the scrolls that were found there is that this was a very special religious community of a sectarian group that had broken away from the mainstream of the Jewish people because they believed that only at the desert, separated from others, or in other sectarian centers that might have existed, could they properly observe the laws of purity and follow the Torah as they understood it. Now, most scholars believe that this is the sect mentioned by Josephus called the Essenes. I myself have raised some question about that, but not in a really definitive way. There are problems about the identification of the group, but one way or another, I think we have to conclude that the site was occupied from about 100 or perhaps 120 BCE to 68 CE by a very, very strict religious group that used it as a center for its religious activity.
Did the scrolls not also shed light on the origins of Christianity, of the era at least, when Christian and changed a lot of the thinking?
Very often misunderstood. In fact, since we started phylacteries, we should point out that phylacteries are mentioned in the New Testament in association with the Pharisees, and the claim is made that they like to wear large phylacteries. But in any case, the point I would make about this is we're dealing with a period which is right before and up to the rise of Christianity. Now, a lot of people mistakenly looked for Jesus and John the Baptist in the scrolls. They're not there. Nor is the origin of Christianity be placed in the scrolls, because the scrolls are fanatically opposite in many ways to the beliefs of Christianity. However, what is definitely the case is that the scrolls show us so much about the Judaism of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE and the early 1st century CE that they've allowed us to have a whole new understanding of the various approaches to Judaism, what we generally call sects, and the various ideologies that existed. With that in hand, we have a much better understanding of the nature of the traditions that underlie the New Testament and that form the background of the New Testament. So what we're dealing with here is a situation in which we get tremendous enlightenment about the general atmosphere. And many scholars have made the mistake of trying to find direct parallels and making claims of direct connections. But once you leave that and go to the indirect, you're dealing with a set of texts that has really enabled us to understand much better the deep roots of Christianity inside the Jewish community at its earliest period.
Lawrence A. Schiffman. Larry Schiffman is Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Yeshiva University, formerly Chair of New York University's Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Malcom Hoenlein. I'm John Batchelor.